Alrighty, so we are getting started on this new show. Welcome to my channel. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is the Ancient Scrolls. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things on this channel, and this is our initial episode. So I want to thank you for being here. We're going to be diving directly into them, and before we do that, make sure you push all the buttons down below to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience. So let's go.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Hello. So we are going to be asking some questions on this channel, and tonight we're going to be operating with the last of the 5 W's. You know, there's who, what, when, where, and now we're going to be talking about the why of it. And this is probably, to me, one of the more powerful questions that can be asked in any topic, because why actually dives to the core of whatever the issue is. What is it we are doing, and particularly the motivations that brought us to this place. So we're going to be looking at some questions about entertainment. In particular, we're talking about role-play games and movies and music, and all of these issues also stem from what I believe to be problems within our culture that we need to address. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to take you with me on this journey of sort of a discovery of what it is that we find that drives us, find what that make us tick. And I'd be glad to look at any comments you would like to add, any questions you might want to ask. Feel free to do so both live in the chat and also in the comment section below. As usual, a video that has a communications capability such as chat is really useful, but I'm not sure whether or not I'll be able to properly answer any questions while we're live, but we will see about that as we go. Let's get started, however, with the first of these questions from the last of the W's. Okay, so the question becomes, why did comic books catapult to the forefront in the last couple of decades? And I think there is something really deeply tied to the concept of heroes that is difficult to express in ways that are not visual. When we hear people regale us with stories concerning the... making sure I got 3 extra buttons. Okie dokie. So the idea of comic books catapulting to the forefront actually is, I believe, found at least a kernel of it in the recent, well, not recent now, the decades-old movie Unbreakable with Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson. In that, there is a scene where Mr. Glass, portrayed by, of course, there I go. My names drop out of my head as soon as I say them. When we are looking at the character of Mr. Glass, he specifies that comic books are fundamentally the equivalent of the ancient murals of cultures far before us, where they regale us with the nature of the heroic. And Samuel Jackson's portrayal really shows through the idea of the strident nature, or the ardent nature, I should say, of the storyteller trying to convey information. And it does really superimpose on the human that which is beyond our ken. And we have been in a culture that has fundamentally been attempting to eliminate the superhero or the superheroic within humanity, even to the point of phrases like God is dead. The idea that we take out that which is superhuman or unbelievable and push it into the fictional realm. And when we do that, we automatically unleash it to make it even more unbelievable. We can make it as fictionally broad in spectrum as we wish, but we also in the process undermine the reality of it. And I think that our culture is coming to the point where the idea of our humanity is becoming almost unbearable. The idea that we are somehow unable to become more than what we are is a burden that our culture is sponsoring and supporting and pushing onto us. The idea that we aren't infallible, we are not immortal, we're not accessible any longer. And so therefore, by doing it in such a fashion, we are now making it so that we can't be as good as those heroes. And then conversely, as we make these motion pictures, and the ones that are resonant, ones that build us up, such as the original Iron Man, episode, Iron Man the first, it really gives us the idea of being able to overcome our difficulties, at least voyeuristically, by watching Tony be able to get past the difficulties of being in that foreign land and having limited resources. He still finds his way to, if you will, MacGyver his way out of the problems. And comic books have therefore supplanted in many ways the, for example, biblical stories. In again, if we look at 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago, we could look at scriptures from the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or these different ritual books, and we could see these stories of the champions and the heroes of those times. But as we have tamped down and blocked out the validity of those Christian or other religious groups to the point where they are no longer widely understood or widely accepted, so that a comic book character can actually provide for us the ability to see the supernatural, but it's obviously put in a way that is clearly fictional. And I think that has therefore created almost like a collective consciousness about our very nature that the comic books can carry forward in ways that other formats may not be able to do so. Furthermore, there's the ability to compartmentalize those and set them aside from the reality that we live in. And therefore, while there are verisimilitudes, the concept is that it's not the world we live in, because, of course, those kind of heroic functions aren't available any longer. So this one's a little bit perhaps more deep, but postmodernism, as you may be aware, posits the concept that since all pursuit of truth bears within it some level of inaccuracy or lack thereof, it's impossible for any one of them to be established as better than any other, and therefore fundamentally ended the argument about what is truth. And I think that this actually culturally is sort of a cop-out. We close out the possibilities of truth in order to be able to maintain our hold on our own personal arbitration thereof. We choose what we want to believe, and therefore we look to others and say, well, you have a right to believe what you want to believe, and I have a right to believe what I want to believe, and both of those can coexist, even though the very concept of postmodernism actually eliminates itself as well, because it's almost like you light a fire and you set it to burn on a starting source, but try to neglect the very fact that there had to be a spark that started it. So postmodernism says there is no there's no way any individual system doesn't have its own flaws, so therefore all systems are flawed. But that also includes the concept of postmodernism being the truth, because if it is true, then it also must fail, and ergo there must be some centralized truth, some way to find an answer to that argument. But the issue is the difficulty with which people approach philosophy requires the idea or the concept that there is a centralized truth that can be discovered. And since we haven't yet definitively discovered what that truth is, therefore it must not even have the possibility of existing. And so in such fashion, fundamentally, it became an easy road to just dismantle the very concepts of expansionist or truth-seeking beyond that point. Lost my camera for a second. Next question is, why aren't there any more public debates? And I say this because it's no longer debate in many ways. Debate has been fundamentally replaced, if you will, with screaming matches. The concept of two individuals standing toe-to-toe and arguing their relative positions is fundamentally it's been relegated to the ash heap. Now, yes, there are certain people who are great at the mechanic of debate, but how many people actually watch or engage with those? And I think that has more to do with our desire to hold on to what we believe, to the exclusion of what might still be out there that we don't necessarily believe. And I think that's really where the problem lies. We are no longer willing to accept or consider the possibility that we might be wrong about anything, so therefore we have cut off any conversation about alternatives. Now, I believe this is the case on both sides of the argument, and as we'll get into in a minute, we'll talk about how that manifests problematically and has really promoted the idea of getting rid of the debates altogether. So this leads to the question of, why did we give up on etiquette? The idea that there are proper ways to behave when interacting with other human beings so that we can be rational, coherent, and reasonable. And that has been, this why is one that I really kind of have to ask you about. Why did we give up on this idea of being polite to each other, to be verbally cautious, and to provide other people with the opportunity to present their case? There's a challenge when we have replaced the idea of propriety with willfulness to the point of making the very possibility of discourse improbable. And I think, and you'll see I say that a lot because I tend to, I think that the biggest challenge with our connection to propriety and fairness and discipline, I mean, there are things about that require us to consider uncomfortable things, and we simply prefer to not have to engage with these seemingly arbitrary rules. We want to instead hold on to what we believe, and that simply is untenable when you have a discussion, because there may be a possibility of another person's case affecting our position, and therefore we have tried to shy away from that, or conversely, other things have taken precedence. And this leads to really one of my real points about why there's no longer any debate, and that is that it's impossible to carry on a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you in a sound and reasonable way. We've gotten to the point where, regardless of whether you are on the left side of the column or the right side of the column, whether you have a specific position that you're devoted to, it becomes impossible for us to carry on discourse when we don't even take the time to listen to the other's argument. And this problematic position, therefore, leaves us in a state where what we have to say is more important than what our oppositions or what our other persons on the panel, so to speak, would have to say, so that we have to make sure we are heard, so we raise our voices and we roll right over each other. And to me, it's one of the very off-putting parts about most modern discourse. If you're looking at like mass media channels and they do the quote talking heads kind of shows, they take away the ability for anybody listening to hear either side fully, because they are running over each other and shouting each other down all the time. And there are reasons for this, I believe, that we will get into near the end of this episode, where we will talk about what I can see as a resolution of this. But it is curious why we have to run over each other, why we can't at least be polite in our conversations. Well, that point about us shouting over each other is because we're not listening. And so the question becomes, why aren't we listening to each other? And the concept of being receptive is in many cases perceived to be a point of weakness, that you may not be holding your conviction strongly enough if you will allow for another person's opinion or commentary to be fully listened to, fully heard out, if as the phrase would go. So why don't we listen? Well, part of the reason why we don't listen is that it would require us to evoke a level of understanding and awareness that by its own nature seems to put us on a softer footing. In other words, we are seemingly looking at every discussion or argumentation point as an all or nothing affair, that we can't perceive of the possibility that it might be not the way we have perceived it to be ourselves, and instead are holding on to our point and stridently evoking it without even demonstrating that we have finished the communications process, because we are not listening to one another. Now, this may be because our attention spans seem to be shrinking. I am old enough to remember the classic American commercials prior to the advent of our current methodology for using advertising. And what I mean by that is the presentation of the case of your property's value to the consumer was not dependent upon how much information you could dump out in an instant, or how much you could draw them into memory. It wasn't necessarily that. It was instead each ad, each presentation, each sponsorship, if you will, of television programming in the past was a clear position of creating a sales opportunity, where you would provide the information about your property, why it is better, more effective, tastier, prettier, whatever. But the idea is that you would make a well thought out argument in your commercial for why your product in particular would be used. But there was a change up in the, I would say, the mid 70s into the early 80s, wherein the commercials shifted to attention grabbing. Some of them were absurd, and intentionally so, to drive your thought process not away from making the decision about the property, but to only remember that property. And I studied marketing, I studied advertising, and I do get that the way impression-based advertising works is that you definitely want to get your word out more often and such like. But I do remember when they were first hiring, when there wasn't yet the recording capability to express what somebody was saying in a faster way, and so they were actually having contests to see who they could get, who could speak their entire commercial boilerplate in the fastest fashion possible, so that could be recorded in the commercial, and that would give them more time for the more outrageous parts of the commercials. But I don't believe that our attention spans are shrinking. I think our attention spans are intentionally being subverted, because if we are focused to think about more things than what we originally intended to, then the splash effect of sound of advertising increases, and therefore gives the publisher thereof a larger piece of our memory. I remember somebody talking about how something gets to live in your brain rent-free, so to speak, if you have opened your mind to it and it's rumbling around in there. It's not something you're going to get rid of. The idea of earworms in songs and such as an example. But I believe that our attention span isn't really shrinking. What we have done instead is that we have abrogated some of our responsibility, and we'll get to that in my closing points. But the idea here is that there is something that is causing our attention spans to be diverted, and we're going to hit on that in particular. And that has to do with the fact that our culture has become throwaway. Now, I think it's kind of clever that when I was a child, there was a commercial that was done. They used an individual who was a Native American, and the old saying was, people start pollution, people can stop it. But the reality is that our culture was becoming a throwaway all the way along, because technology's speed was so high that the things that we had that were still functioning, still useful, they were no longer the best, the fastest, the most appealing visually. And all of these things fed into a culture that literally discards things of potential monetary value in favor of something that is going to feed the other parts of our ego. And the idea of a throwaway culture also is promoted with the concept of the fast food restaurants. Fast food restaurants are promoted because employers don't want to be paying for people on their, quote, lunch hour to take the full hour or more. Many times the period is been limited out of existence, and the idea is that we are casting our lives on the wind, so to speak, trying to find things of value, but anything that we find that might have value is known or perceived to be easily replaced by the next new thing. And when we do that, we actually undermine our ability to appreciate, and we'll get, again, there's a reason for this, I believe, and we're coming up on that conclusion here in a moment. So the concept of self-discipline is really a matter of how do we represent ourselves in our world. And while many individuals do have a fine source of self-discipline, many people, for example, such as myself, went through the military at one point or other in their lives and developed some of the mechanisms for it. But we have foregone that. We have actually moved away from that self-discipline because of the numbers of choices that were provided. There was an interesting book written quite some time ago now called When Choices Made God. And the idea is that we make, 50 decisions before we get out of the house in the morning, from whether we get up at the first alarm or we wait till the second. We just choose whether or not we're going to focus on washing our hair today, or if it's going to be something that we just do as a perfunctory activity. Each one of these different decisions that we make predicates a whole bunch of new decisions we have to make, and pretty soon there are so many that it's far easier to fall into patternistic responses and results instead of actually doing the work of deciding or even thinking about the things that we have to choose between, and therefore we have fundamentally undermined the very nature of self-discipline. Now, before we get to this last point, I wanted to address the fact that there is a solution to all of these, and these are interconnected, even though it feels like I've kind of been wandering a bit. It's my belief that we are lacking imagination. Our culture has fundamentally shut down our individual creativity and our own ability to constructively think through decisions, because we were told and we've allowed ourselves to accept the belief that as we get older, we should not be living in that place of what people call an active imagination. We should instead be operating on a rote, a patternistic, repetitive process. And our culture has fundamentally erased itself in favor of letting something else make the decisions for us, whether it be politics, whether it be motion picture industry. We no longer have to create for ourselves in our minds the mental pictures of what things might look like if an effect occurs. We can instead watch the movie version and it will be spoon-fed to us. As you know, or as you may know, as a dungeon master and game master for role-playing games with more than 50 years of experience, I'm a big fan of The Lord of the Rings. And when you look at The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, in its written form, it's a monster. It's 3 volumes, and there are fight scenes, and there are action-packed scenes, there's drama, all in a literary form. And the amount of that can be digested requires there to be a considerable amount of personal imagination invoked in the reading of it, because you have to be able to visualize for yourself what's going on in that story. And I know that there are those who have considerations about whether or not they can visualize or not, but nonetheless, we all have the capability of reading a passage and perceiving of what that passage refers to. And the idea that we don't invoke our imagination, as a matter of fact, in the case of the Lord of the Rings series, you're looking at what the director had in his mind, and therefore his translation becomes the visualized. And since we now have a visual image that can be replicated, we're no longer needing to imagine, for example, what the Balrog looks like, or the way the interaction occurs. The book, therefore, is now subject to what the viewers see and what they perceive. And that, in my estimation, is problematic, because that takes away from us as individuals the agency to make our own decisions and perceive of it the way we perceive of it. As a matter of fact, in many cases, we're reminded to put aside the childish things and become, adults, and it's almost as if we're told to put our imagination on the back burner and instead utilize our imitation in order to carry it forward, as evidenced in the toy market and even in the games market. We want the way you play to be defined by the property you're using to play. So, well, this is my first episode here on the Ancient Scroll. I want to thank you for being here and being a part of it. I'm going to get better at my transitions, and I'm going to get better at all of this because I'm new. But if you want to see some of our other materials, check out my other website, my other YouTube channel.